there. So that says to me that even the reported stuff, which is probably the tip on the iceberg, suggests that there's a whole lot of cooperation in many parts of the country going on between transit operators and taxi and paratransit operators. There are certainly many examples of this. One I want to speak to, which I've already introduced to you, is the Access Paratransit System in Pittsburgh. As I said to you, in the 70s, we were looking for ways to improve service to persons with disabilities and senior citizens. And Pittsburgh was an interesting place to go do that kind of work because there already had been a fair amount of academic work done in that area. There was a number of studies in the early 70s, late 60s about the jitneys of Pittsburgh, not necessarily a phrase that this group would love very much, but at least it began to look at what is some of the latent demand for different kinds of services than was being provided. In fact, a professor at Carnegie Mellon University shortly thereafter, a guy named Dwight Bauman, bought a cab company, People's Taxi. Some of you may or may not have heard of People's Taxi in Pittsburgh. And he wanted to do that for a couple of reasons. One was academic, to study it more and understand the business more and that type of thing. Second thing, he was a mechanical engineer. He was interested in seeing how we might apply modern information technology. And an awful lot of the modern technology that I now see up on your screen that's vended to you started in some test stuff in places like Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on that. But the root of all that research that became important to us was work done by a professor by the name of Al Bloomstein. Al looked at the Pittsburgh market. He saw many, many taxi companies, and the largest company had many, many cabs. And he was hearing more and more about seniors and persons with disabilities who needed service. And his notion was to set up a brokerage where you could blend the service needs of the customer with the cab companies who had service that they were willing to provide. And out of some work in Carnegie Mellon came then a plan that I was hired in Pittsburgh to implement when I went there in 1977. Sounds so simple, but the fact of the matter, a very difficult concept. And yet we persevered, and over the next several years, worked with all the different private sector folks, worked with the public public agencies and nonprofit agencies that were interested in that, and steadfastly operated with a rule that we would not hire any of our own people, and lo and behold, we managed to come up with Access. It was from about 1981 or 2 until about 1994, the largest specialized paratransit service in the world, only ultimately to be surpassed by New York and Chicago and Los Angeles. Where's my Philadelphia friend? And only very recently by Philadelphia, like in the last 3 years, something like that. So it did work. We proved some interesting things that I think you already know, but at the time the world didn't know, which was that the private sector was willing, that the private sector, if you involved them properly in this, would do things that they historically hadn't done, like acquire equipment that had more accessibility features than was historically true, like do additional driver training beyond what historically the industry had done. And so bottom line, if you go to Pittsburgh today, we might be the 4th or 5th largest paratransit service in North America now, but we're still serving about 1.9 million trips a year. We're doing it in the equivalent of about 400 vehicles a day, and of those 400 vehicles, something like 380 of them are still provided by the private sector providers that are involved. So I give you that as a bit of background, as I think there are still some lessons to be learned from that experience. But we now have examples like that in many, many communities around the country. Here I want to hold up a report. Matt, are you familiar with that? And have you talked to this group about that, so I don't bore them 2 or 3 times with what you already said? Yeah. All right, I talked about the Transit Cooperative Research Program, TCRP. If your eyes are really good, maybe you can read that TCRP on there. If you can read that, your eyes are too good, but there's TCRP up there. It's report number 75, and if these ideas that I'm talking to you about are of interest to you, you might want to get a hold of that. You can get it through us or through the Transportation Research Board, a number of other places that you can get it. The title of the report is The Role of the Private For-Hire Vehicle Industry in Public Transportation. It goes on at great length to try to define taxi cabs and black cars and sedans and on and on and on, and comes to the conclusion that you have to have another name, which they then call the PHV industry, which sounds like a disease I'm supposed to protect my daughter from, so I don't particularly like that. But anyhow, it includes us all in there. And you may, I would recommend that to you. Now, the unfortunate thing about this study, as far as I know, it's the only one of its type that's ever been done, and it was published in 2002, and it used data from about 1996 through 98 for much of what it did. So one of my conclusions today is we ought to join together and update this thing, or if somebody wants something better, figure out something better to do. But I think it is plenty of time to do that. By the way, part of the reason that study was done, on the governing board, the Transportation Cooperative Research Program has a governing board, the people who actually choose the research that gets done, and many operators are on that. And historically, there have been taxi operators on that board. And Lee Barnes of Barwood Taxi in Montgomery County, Maryland, was for many, many years a member of that board. And I kind of suspect, though my memory has long ago left me on the topic, that the reason this report got done was probably because Lee was on the board. Also, the report, the lead researcher on that was a gentleman you should know, Gorman Gilbert, who was a former taxi commissioner at Matt's old stomping grounds there, and then became a professor at several different universities over time on that. Well, the study goes, I think there are three important things that, to talk about out of the study. One is a lesson learned section, one is a conclusions, and one is what it suggests is needed for future research. And again, I'm not sure that they are going to be a lot different than what you may already know. When they were looking at the lessons learned, they tried to say, well, what were the benefits of the cooperation that occurred, and what were the genuine barriers? What had to be overcome in order to get those benefits? So on the benefits side, they looked at 8 different cooperation arrangements around the country. Some work in Houston, some work in Ann Arbor, Michigan, 3 different small systems in Wisconsin, suburban Washington, D.C., I don't know, 2 or 3 other places. And so they were analyzing various size systems and various different types of cooperation. They did find, generally speaking, across the board cost savings in the services that were offered. Again, I think you would expect that, and they did, but it's always good when they find it. They did find also that it was, by involving the private sector, was an efficient way to meet peak demand. Not only an improvement to client services, in other words, the intended audience for the improvement, whether it's persons with disabilities or seniors or whoever it might have been, peak hour commuters, whatever, yeah, they saw an improvement. But the interesting thing they noticed, and it's the same thing we observed in Pittsburgh with Access, the general taxi public was better served. Why? Because there was an increase in revenue flow through the systems. Equipment had to meet higher standards, and generally that paid off for the public at large as well as for the special groups that were there. Part of the reason for that, too, from the standpoint of the operator, of the private operator, having these contracts smoothed out their cash flow, took away some of the seasonality of their work, and generally seemed to be quite a good thing. But there were not, it was not all lightness and roses. They talked about a number of barriers and things that made it very, very difficult. And I'm not going to go into much detail. It's much more deeply covered in the report. There was difficulty in meeting service demand. Well, okay. Insufficient qualified drivers, something that I think we still have today. Driver reluctance. Now, they phrased it nicely. They said driver reluctance to operate accessible vehicles. I might, as an old operator myself, say something like driver's refusal to do what they're supposed to in their job, but that would be very rude, so I wouldn't say that way. But they did, it suggested that the training issues were much larger than anybody had expected involved in it. And of course, they found that again, remember, we're dealing with the late 90s, that most systems didn't have accessible vehicles, so they didn't have the experience with those vehicles, and that made life pretty difficult as well. Well, in their conclusions, though, they say despite the barriers that they were documenting, most of those 8 systems had gotten through, or projects had gotten through the problems satisfactorily, that the benefits clearly outweighed the barriers. And that especially became true and happened quickly where good partnerships were formed. In other words, in those communities where the private carrier and the public carrier got it together, really sat down and talked, figured out what each interest was, because the interests weren't always the same, and then focused on what is the common thing we need to do in order to meet our private and public interests, that worked out well. So again, today as I look back on that, I'm not sure those are revolutionary conclusions, but it's always nice to know that somebody else has seen the same things that you have seen and experienced them. They did make 5 recommendations for further research. One was the obvious. They, even when they published it, recognized that it was already out of date, and so would like new and better data. They felt something ought to be done in a longitudinal way. In other words, following these projects, not just take a snapshot at a point in time, but what happened to that project 5 years later, what happened to that project 10 years later, or in the case of now, some of the projects like Access are more than 30 years old. What happened to those things over time? How did they change? Did the benefits that were there at the beginning, are they still there? Did they vanish? What happened? Those kinds of things. Third, they felt that there ought to be contracting, minimum contracting provisions that are agreed to. In other words, that what's the word I'm looking for? That we ought to have a model set of provisions. And yes, each state, each city has its own little unique aspects, so it's not likely anybody can adopt the model provisions completely. But if we knew what the best provisions were to have, and then you could take them back home and within your legal framework use as much of that as you could, that would be better. Fourth, basically don't reinvent the wheel, that there's enough experience out there that we ought to be documenting, and if we did document it right and developed a best practices manual, that is something that could be very, very helpful and a good thing. And then along with that, they said, try to synthesize the various regulations, identify what are the things in communities that have worked and the stuff that hasn't, and again, plug that into the kind of best practices approach. So if you're not familiar with this study, I think it's a good one. I would recommend it to you if you have interest in this area. Recognize it's a bit dated, but I think we ought to work to pull it out. Let me finish up with just a couple of other situations. And by the way, I don't think I gave proper credit to Al. You guys, as I recall, were very much involved in that study, and I should have done that right out of the get-go, sir. So I wish I could say I had much to do with it, but other than founding the program, I didn't have anything to do with it. So, Al, I appreciate that a lot. And another thing I would just mention to you, particularly those of you that are interested in contracting in areas for providing specialized services to persons with disabilities, I hope that you are familiar with Project Action, which is a project of the Easter Seal Society. Again, it has been funded by the federal government over the past, I guess that goes back now almost 15 years itself, probably. To the late 80s. And that